Hi, this is going to be a spoiler-free preparation for reading Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. I have this beautiful edition of the novel that I found on my trip to New Zealand last year. I already miss it so much. And they had this amazing bookstore where I found a couple of really beautiful books, and this was one of them. I know that a lot of classic authors that I love to read loved Ivanhoe, or the author Sir Walter Scott, and this was my main motivation to finally pick up one of his books. This is an edition from 1911, so it feels extra special. Let me first tell you about the structure of this video. So first I'm going to be talking a bit about the author. I'm going to give you some background information on the novel to prepare you without spoilers to go ahead and read it. And at the end of the video, I'm going to be sharing my personal opinion. Walter Scott was a historian, a poet, a playwright, and a novelist. And he as good as invented the genre of historical romance novels. His books aren't as popular anymore, and indeed I didn't find many videos talking about his books. This book comes with many challenges, at least it did for me, and I am here to try and help you ease into the story and to tell you what I wish I knew before I picked up this book. First of all, some background information. Ivanhoe is a historical romance novel. It was published in 1819 in 3 volumes. This is something I really miss nowadays, that bigger books always have one part instead of volumes. I wish they could bring back the volume thing, because I really love having, for example, War and Peace in 3 volumes. I have this box set by Everyman's Library where the novel is divided into 3 volumes, and I love that so much. I wish publishers would do that more often. The story is set in England in the Middle Ages in 1194, and it is set after the failure of the Third Crusade, when many of the Crusaders were still returning to their homes from Europe. And the novel tells about the period just after King Richard's imprisonment in Austria, following the crusade of his return to England after a ransom is paid. After reading the first chapter, I was so confused, and I needed to do some background research first in order to really grasp what was going on. It is useful to have some knowledge before going in about King Richard the Lionheart, about Robin Hood. If you have some vague idea of who he was, you'll be fine, and about Prince John. It is also good to know that the story takes place in a time in England where the nobility was overwhelmingly Norman. One of the things I loved most is how Walter Scott can transport you to the Middle Ages. I really felt immersed in this time period. Also interesting to know is that there are a lot of references to Shakespeare. I think Sir Walter Scott was rather fond of the bard. And I mentioned this because I've seen reviews where people say that Sir Walter Scott has stolen a lot from Shakespeare's work, that he took characters as an inspiration and then used them for his own work. And I must say this bothers me a bit, because yes, there are references to Shakespeare, and it's okay if Walter Scott was fond of his work. He references to Shakespeare's characters, and I will tell you which ones. Maybe you're interested in reading the plays before you dive into Ivanhoe. Not that it's something that I would recommend per se, but it might be fun. But the reason why I bring this up is because on page 184 in my edition, my awesome, amazing old vintage edition, there is a quote, starting chapter 22 with a quote from Merchant of Venice. And it says, "My daughter, oh my ducats, oh my daughter, oh my Christian ducats, justice, the law, my ducats, oh my daughter," which is referring to a character in Shakespeare's play. Now I see reviewers mention the Jewish character who plays a very important role in this novel has been stolen from Shakespeare's character, who Sir Walter Scott mentions here in this quote. It was clearly intentional. He wasn't hiding the fact. He's literally quoting the character that people accuse him of stealing. So yeah, I don't see any problems with such a thing whatsoever. I think the biggest challenge, aside from knowing your history, is the writing style, which is very old. It feels very Shakespearean, and I want to give you an idea of the writing style because I had no idea it was this old and Shakespearean. Nay, but I must see the writers, answered Wamba. Perhaps they are come from fairyland with a message from King Oberon. A murrain take thee, rejoined the swineherd. Wilt thou talk of such things, while a terrible storm of thunder and lightning is raging within a few miles of us? Hark, how the thunder rumbles, and for summer rain I never saw such broad, downright flat drops fall out of the clouds. The oaks, too, notwithstanding the calm weather, sob and creak with their great boughs, as if announcing a tempest. Thou canst play the rational, if thou wilt. Credit me for once, and let us home ere the storm begins to rage, for the night will be fearful. This is the writing style, and I can imagine that a lot of people would not like this kind of writing, which also explains why a lot of modern readers cannot get into this novel. I think it's important to know beforehand, before you go in, because it is not... It's a rather big novel. I didn't really mind, though I must admit that midway the novel, I started to struggle a little bit with the writing. I think it's mainly because English isn't my first language, and it gets exhausting after a while to have to focus so much on the dialogue and on the writing style, because I needed to go really slow in order to really understand. Okay, so now I'm going to give you all the advice that I have gathered while reading this novel and that I wish I knew beforehand. First of all, when you first start reading, that first chapter is the most difficult of all. That reminds me, I actually saw someone say in a review that this must be one of the easiest novels one could ever read, and I highly disagree. The first chapter is definitely the hardest. It takes time to get used to the writing style, and I read it multiple times to really get used to the style and to what was going on, because after my first read of the chapter, I had no idea. I would recommend you to research the time period or watch my video until the end, because I'm going to tell you all that you need to know. Secondly, you need to be prepared for the antique writing style, the Shakespearean writing style. If you cannot stand Old English, then this book is not for you and you have to skip it. I didn't have any trouble keeping the characters apart, so I wouldn't say that it's necessary to keep a list, to have paper with you and to jot down all the characters, because the names are very different from each other and I didn't have any problems with keeping them apart. Another piece of advice, if you are a beginner with classic literature, you haven't read many classics, then I wouldn't recommend this one, because it's not a beginner's classic. And the final point of advice is to go slow and take your time, especially in the beginning, because it's gonna pay off. If you pay attention and if you really get everything that is going on, you're going to enjoy it much, much more. If I didn't research the time period and if I just said, well, I'm just going to read it, I wouldn't have enjoyed it. I think I would have enjoyed it 50% less than I did. I can say that I read this novel very deeply. I summarized every chapter. So after finishing a chapter, and these are very short, actually, they're rather short, I summarized everything that happened and then I went on to the next chapter. So I guess you can say it was a bit of a study of a book, because I normally don't summarize every chapter. I don't know why I felt like doing it with this one. I think because it wasn't easy for me, and I started writing down all my research in my journal, in my reading journal. If you're interested in knowing more about all of my journals and my commonplace books, you can check out my video, because I did an in-depth video about all of my commonplace books. But I think it was because I started with the research, starting writing things down and marking things, that it urged me to go on and to summarize each chapter. Now let's dive into the history and everything you need to know. I hope you pardon me for reading my notes. So first of all, Jewish people. There was a lot of discrimination and hostility towards them due to religion and ethnic background. And this is something that is really, present. It's really present in this novel, and you need to know that it was just the time period. Secondly, Anglo-Saxons and Normans. So you need to know the groups. There was a hostility between these groups, and this resulted from the Norman conquest, leading to a Norman rule over England. So the Normans ruled England, and there was a clash of culture and of language. Number 3, Richard the Lionheart is a very important character. You need to know that the return of Richard brought back stability to England, and he was a very popular fellow. He was really loved. Next, you need to know about the Franklins. They were a social class, and they were inferior. They were neither peasants nor nobles. They were land-owning freemen, and they were not subjected to any authority of a lord. Next, you need to know about Duke William of Normandy. His conquest enhanced the tyranny of the nobility, and he was also named King William II of England, or William the Conqueror. And finally, the Battle of Hastings. This was a battle between Harold II and Duke William. So the Norman French army was fighting the English one. If you're interested in this time period, then I highly recommend reading some more things about it online, because it's going to pay off when reading the novel. Now, what's my opinion about it? I really enjoyed it. It took me some time to get used to the writing, but that's okay. It was very readable. After I had read, let's say, 10 chapters, I was into the story. He transported me to the Middle Ages like no one ever has. He's really talented in just making your surroundings disappear, which was amazing. But there was one big thing that I didn't like at all. The characters, they were interesting, but they lack depth. And if the author would have taken more time making them real, and put more detail into them, making them feel real, this would have been such a grand novel. But because they lacked depth, they felt very distant. Except for Rebecca, she felt more developed than the other characters. But I highly recommend it if you like historical romance novels, because this is where it all started. If you've made it this far, leave me a book emoticon in the comment section so I know who you are. If you like historical novels, you might be interested in checking out my review on the Three Musketeers on my channel. I hope you'll stick around, and I will see you next week.